Okay, hopefully people have had time to join us. Welcome everyone. My name is Chloe Ferrand. I'm a senior reporter at Climate Home News, and I will be moderating at today's event. So a bit of an introduction. At COP26 last November, 34 countries and 5 public finance institutions signed a joint commitment to end international public finance for coal, oil and gas by the end of this year, and instead prioritize public finance for clean energy. A report by IISD, Oil Change International and Tearfund published today finds that since then, and with 5 months to go to COP27, most of the signatories are yet to adopt fossil fuel exclusion policies that match their commitments. On Tuesday, the G7 met in Germany, and leaders reaffirmed the COP26 statement, but included new loopholes for international gas financing beyond the end of the year deadline. The G7 agreed that investments in LNG is necessary, and publicly supported investment in the gas sector can be appropriate as temporary measures to the energy crisis, which has been triggered by the war in Ukraine. That's only if it's aligned with the 1.5-degree goal and doesn't create a lock-in effect. Campaigners have criticized the statement and accused the G7 of backsliding on their prior COP26 commitment. However, there is good practice out there. The report shows it in Denmark, the UK, as well as the Dutch Development Bank, the FMO, and the European Investment Bank, just to name a few. Their experiences of implementing the pledge can provide a way forward for others to follow suit. So before we delve any further into the topic, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll start today's event with a presentation of the report. So 2 of the authors, Lucille Dufour of IISD and Larry van der Berg of Oil Change International, will give you an oversight of the report and its findings. Then we'll hear from our panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. We're very lucky to have a great panel with us today, and I'm really hoping that we can get an engaged discussion on this. And then finally, we'll have around 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. You probably know the drill by now. If you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A box at any time during the event, and we'll get to them when we get to the Q&A section. And finally, you've probably noticed the event is being recorded, and I believe that the recording can be made available afterwards. So let's get going. Lucille from IISD and Larry of Oil Change International, do you want to start by introducing the report?
Yes, thank you, Chloe. So first of all, thanks to everyone who is tuning in today. I'm very excited about the opportunity to present our report at this timely moment. As announced, Lucille and I are going to take you through our key findings, but first I'm going to repeat some of the recent developments that Chloe just outlined for you, so that we are all on the same page. Ending public finance for fossil fuels was a central topic at the G7 this week. And at COP26 last year, 6 of the G7 countries signed onto the Glasgow Pledge to end international public finance for fossil fuels by the end of this year. A near identical commitment was adopted by G7 ministers in May, and this brought Japan on board. And this is relevant because Japan is the world's 2nd largest financier of fossil fuels. This week's G7 leaders communique reconfirmed the commitment, but as Chloe already mentioned, new caveats were added. Next slide, please. And you can also go to the next slide. Yes. The G7 said that investments in LNG are necessary in response to the current crisis, though they noted that these investments need to be temporary and consistent with climate goals. Next slide, please. This cannot lead to investments in new long-lived gas infrastructure. New gas infrastructure is not a viable solution to rapidly reduce fossil fuel imports from Russia because it takes years to build. It is also not temporary. Analysis shows that while some investments in existing gas infrastructure might be needed, new gas infrastructure is not needed. Renewable energy and efficiency solutions can be deployed faster, they better serve energy security and energy access needs, and they do not come with the stranded assets and financial stability risks of gas. And the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, seems to agree. Just a day after the G7 communique was published, he tweeted, that new funding for fossil fuel exploration and production infrastructure is delusional. Fossil fuels are not the answer, renewable energy is. So it must be clear, next slide please, that the G7 commitment cannot be a free pass for gas investments and must not be allowed to derail the implementation of the Glasgow Pledge. In Glasgow, 39 countries and institutions agreed to prioritize their public support for clean energy and new direct public support for unabated fossil fuels by the end of 2022, and ensure that other countries and institutions follow suit. And this is critical for climate goals. Next slide, please. According to the IEA, to maintain a 50% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, there can be no investments in new coal, oil, or gas supply or LNG infrastructure without stranded assets. Research published in Nature shows that unless some assets are retired early, the committed emissions from already developed reserves and existing energy infrastructure reach the 1.5 degree target. The science also shows that there is no space for gas as a bridge fuel. Next slide, please. We need to start winding down gas production and use now. And the good news is that gas is also not needed for development, because as you can see in this graph, renewable-based alternatives for most uses are available and are either already cheaper or will be within a few years. And if anything, the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis have only strengthened the need to reduce dependence on fossil fuels, whether produced in Russia or elsewhere in the world. And clean energy solutions also come with many development benefits, as they create more jobs, less air pollution, they can be deployed faster than new fossil fuel infrastructure, and they avoid technological lock-in. Yet the investments are nowhere near the levels needed, and public finance flows to clean energy will need to more than triple in the next 5 years to around 250 billion per year by 2026. And next slide, please. Our report shows that the Glasgow Statement can play a crucial role in unlocking the finance needed for clean, because signatories have an opportunity to shift at least $28 billion a year out of fossil fuels and into clean energy if they follow through on their commitments. And if this encourages Japan to follow through, this further increases the potential shift to 39 billion a year. This would leverage an even larger shift in public and private finance, and it can close the climate finance gap. Though I should note that there is strong consensus that a much higher target than the 100 billion a year promised by rich countries is needed to reflect fair shares and a realistic pathway to limiting the climate crisis. With only 6 months to go until the end of the 2022 deadline, most countries and institutions still need to publish new or updated and Glasgow-aligned policies, and export credit agencies lag behind most. One of the main implementation risks that we see is that signatories introduce large exemptions for gas support. This was already a risk and is now an even bigger risk because of the war in Ukraine. Another one is that countries and institutions lack concrete strategies to increase clean energy support. And OCI data shows that rather than increasing exponentially, clean energy support has stagnated in recent years. But countries can follow through on their commitments and good practices exist. And Lucie will discuss this in more detail. It is critical that these best practice policies don't get weakened in response to the war in Ukraine. In our report, we also highlight that to show integrity, signatories must also end domestic fossil fuel subsidies, ban new licenses for oil and gas production, and phase out extraction on a just and 1.5 degree aligned timeline. So now let's take a look at the energy finance trends in signatory countries. Next slide, please. The development finance and export credit support data that we've used here comes from OCI's Public Finance for Energy database. That is a publicly accessible database that covers 14,000 transactions worth over more than $2 trillion, and you can access it on energyfinance.org. We also used government and institution reporting, the Global Aid Atlas, and the OECD database for this report. And the data shows that Canada, the United States, Italy, and Germany provided most of the 28 billion a year in fossil fuel finance, and ECAs were the source of over 80% of this support. Less than 1% of energy finance went to coal. And this suggests that earlier exclusions have had effect, though indirect coal support through financial intermediaries remains a threat. Most of the money now flows to gas projects, and past IISD analysis shows that most gas finance from G20 countries to lower income countries flows to LNG, export infrastructure, and power generation. Flows to clean energy were significantly lower than the support provided to fossil fuels at 18 billion a year, and only 7 out of 39 signatories provided more clean than fossil fuel finance between 2018 and 2020. And despite assertions that public finance for fossil fuels supports development, the largest recipients were not low-income countries, but upper and upper middle-income countries for both fossil fuel and clean energy. And Saudi Arabia was the biggest recipient of fossil fuel finance from the Glasgow Statement signatories. Most of the finance, namely 64%, was provided in the form of loans. And this compares to just 0.6% that was provided as grants. And this suggests that there is a need to prioritize grant-based financing to avoid already unsustainable debt levels to rise even further. And for those who prefer a visual representation, I'll share some graphs. Next slide, please. So this first figure shows the average annual public finance flows by country split into fossil fuel, clean, and other energy sources. Next graph, please. And this one shows fossil fuel support split by fuel. And as you can see here, most of the support flows to gas, which is the blue bar in this figure. And then the last, or the next slide, please. And this last figure shows the biggest recipients of public finance, with Saudi Arabia and Mozambique receiving most fossil fuel support, and Spain and France receiving most clean energy support. Next slide, please. So if you want to dive deeper in the data, you can either read our reports or visit energyfinance.org, or do both. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll hand over to Lucille. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rory, for this first presentation of data findings. And I'm now going to present some of the findings linked to the policy analysis in the report and also our main recommendations. I also apologize in advance. There is some construction work in my building today, so you may hear a little bit of background noise during my presentation. So let's start with the policy analysis. And in terms of this analysis, what we've done in the report is that we've looked at the pre-existing fossil fuel exclusion policies and clean energy strategies that are implemented by the high income signatories to the Glasgow Statement. Either through their development finance institutions, so through their export credit agencies, or through what we call whole of government approaches, which cover all types of different international public finance. Once we've looked at the policies, we've assessed them against a set of criteria that reflect what we consider being an implementation of the Glasgow Statement with integrity, which means in line with the 1.5-degree limit. What it helps us gauge is the scale of the effort that is required for signatories between now and COP27 to really deliver on the commitments that they took at the COP26. So let's get into the presentation itself. And before I get into the findings, what I wanted to clarify is what we mean by policies that are, and especially fossil fuel exclusion policies that are compatible with the Glasgow Statement. So as you see on this graph, the Glasgow Statement applies across the entire fossil fuel value chain for coal, oil, and gas. What it means is that implementing the Glasgow Statement with integrity implies applying strict exclusion for finance for upstream, midstream, and downstream projects. And I know that there has been a lot of debates in the past days, and Laurie has mentioned them, around whether gas should be exempted. But we do argue, as Laurie mentioned, that long-lived gas infrastructure investment should not be supported by public finance because of the high climate risks, lock-in risks associated to these, and because clean alternatives are already available. One point maybe in addition to that as well is that some governments have claimed that some of these gas infrastructure can be repurposed to clean uses, for instance, for green hydrogen, but we do believe that this repurposing is going to be highly costly and technologically limited, so not really an option. Last point about what we consider being aligned. So the Glasgow Statement applies to unabated finance, unabated fossil fuels, and some governments have wondered whether there's space for abated solutions, so basically solutions with carbon capture and storage. And here again, because of the high costs of CCS and because of the technological limitation, we don't think there is much space for public finance for this kind of technologies. So really what we consider being aligned are fossil fuel exclusion policies, which implement stringent exclusions across the entire value chain. So let's get into what we actually find. And on this table on the right-hand side, you can see the main findings of our policy analysis. And spoiler alert, I've got some good news for you, but also some relatively bad news. So on the table, the green dots that you see are policies that we consider as being aligned with the Glasgow Statement. The orange dots mean policies which include some exclusion for fossil fuels, but with limitations. And the red dots mean either no policy or policies that are off track. So I'm going to start with the bad news and then get into the good news. The first, the key finding that we have is that with 6 months to go, most countries and institutions still need to implement very stringent exclusion policies. And actually, in the 30 institutions that we analyzed, we found that 1/3 still doesn't have any kind of publicized fossil fuel exclusion policy, which means that they will have to develop one in the next 6 months. The second thing, which is pretty obvious from this table, is that export credit agencies on the right are lagging behind the most. And this is because most of them still do not have firm exclusion policies for upstream projects, so those related to production and extraction and exploration of coal, oil, and gas. Finally, the last point that I wanted to mention is that for most of these policies, there is not yet any kind of stringent gas exclusion, or there are some gas exclusions, but they're insufficient. Let's now turn to the good news, and this is the one that I would like to insist on for the rest of this presentation. And the good news is that a few institutions and governments already have policies that are aligned with the Glasgow Statement commitments. And these are either whole of government approaches from Denmark and the United Kingdom, or specific policies adopted in institutions such as the European Investment Bank, the French Development Agency, the FMO in the Netherlands, and Swedfund in Sweden. So that's a very good news because it means that solutions exist and that these policies can serve as example for other signatories to implement their commitment. And the question is, what makes these policies different from the others? The main answer is that these policies already implement strong tools and robust tools to restrict gas funding, especially for long-lived gas infrastructure. And we found several tools in the report that enable to do this. And we found that the most efficient tools are either blanket exclusions, so basically leaving no space for new investment in gas power plants or midstream gas. It's the case, for instance, in Swedfund or the French Development Agency. And we also have some tools that are around applying cumulative set of criteria, screening criteria that basically leave very, very, very little room for approving new projects that are associated with long-lived gas infrastructure. And this is the case in Denmark, FMO, and the United Kingdom. So here, I think what is important to remember is that we have the policy tools, we have the policy frameworks that are available, and we know that they work. So I think it's a very good news for other signatories because it means that they can implement this kind of policies in the next 6 months. Turning rapidly to the clean energy strategies, which are really important in terms of shifting the finance towards clean. Here we find that there is a lot of room for improvement, especially because out of the 15 development finance institutions that we analyze, some of them do have quantified climate finance targets, but really a few of them have quantified clean energy finance targets. And similarly, very few of them have qualitative targets associated with the clean energy finance priorities or set just transition support as a main pillar of that strategy. When it comes to export credit agencies, unfortunately, there are no harmonized approaches yet. Finally, I'm going to get into our main recommendations, and they are twofold. There are recommendations that are linked to how signatories can turn their pledges into action by COP27. And I'm going to go quickly through them because I think Laurie and I have been through them a lot in the past few minutes. But it's really around implementing these fossil fuel exclusions that leave no room for new finance for upstream or midstream projects, and that clearly exclude long-lived gas infrastructure, including gas-fired power, while leaving some very limited exemption, for instance, for liquefied petroleum gas for clean cooking or clean heating. The third recommendation is around applying fossil fuel exclusions not only to direct finance, which is the case now, but also to indirect finance, because we know that this type of finance is growing very fast. Finally, and this is a very important one, signatories really need to develop these concrete plans to shift finance into clean energy and also increase clean energy finance, as well as developing collaborations with the low and middle income signatories of the statement. A second set of recommendations is really about how signatories can shift the energy landscape and the energy finance landscape. And they can do it in three ways. The first one is securing new signatories to join the statement by COP27, especially those big providers that are not yet in the statement, such as China and Korea. They can also have influence in other spaces, especially at multilateral development banks or through the OECD, to implement more stringent fossil fuel exclusions. And finally, they can also contribute to setting coherent policies at home, especially around phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and ending or banning new licenses for oil and gas production. Thanks very much. Happy to take questions later on and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lucille. That was great. Really good overview of the report. So it's time to turn to our panel. Hopefully they can give us a sense of how we shift those $28 billion a year from fossil fuels to clean energy, and looking forward to this conversation. So I'll give you some introductions. So with us today is John Merton. He's the UK COP26 envoy who has worked extensively as an ambassador diplomat across Africa and Asia as well, I believe. Joachim Schraven is the Director of Impact and ESG Department at the Dutch Development Bank, FMO. Vivian Jede is the Director General of the East African Development Bank. And we also have Promise Salaru, who's joining us from Nigeria. He's a youth activist working with grassroots communities and also the charity Tearfund in Nigeria. So welcome to you all. We're delighted to have you. Thank you so much for making some time to be with us today. You each are going to have 3 minutes for some brief opening remarks before we get into the discussion stage of today's event. There's lots to talk about, so let's try and stick to the time so we can get through as many questions as we can. So John, I'd like to invite you to turn on your camera if you are here. Great, hello. Great, I'd like to start with you if that's okay. The UK gets a green tick from the report for the way it has introduced a whole of government fossil fuel exclusion to deliver on the COP26 statement, which it initiated in Glasgow last year. Can you share how these policies came about and the lessons that you've learned along the way in implementing them?
Thanks, Chloe, and thanks for everyone for joining. So ahead of COP26, we knew that if we were to encourage everyone around the world to be ambitious in their climate commitments at COP26, we had to walk the walk ourselves. There's nothing, more embarrassing than someone who's encouraging people to do things they're not doing themselves. And as we were working through that, we came across a number of projects that the UK various bodies like UK Export Finance were set to fund overseas that weren't really in line with our climate goals, and we could see the potential for hypocrisy in that. So we worked very hard in 2021 to come to a policy that would end our international support for fossil fuels, so that we would be putting all our tax money, when we're spending it overseas, putting all our dollars in sort of in line with our climate commitments, because we were conscious actually, and we did an analysis that because the fossil fuel sector is declining, as sort of industry leaders sort of become aware of the debate of climate change and what it means for their business, actually it increasingly needed public support in order to get fossil fuel projects over the line, because essentially they're becoming a sunset industry. So we've worked very hard back in March 2021 to take a UK policy and set out our position, and then in the 6 months that remained before COP26 to internationalize that. And importantly, the UK position included what you referred to. It included a reference to indirect finance, and the fact that, you know, we needed to find a policy that worked, so that we didn't just, if you had a big conglomerate who just sold a couple of things in the oil and gas sector, you couldn't cut off all working capital to a firm like that. But we've got a sliding scale that comes down every year for the percentage of a company's turnover that is in that sector if they want to apply for indirect finance. And of course, all direct finance is phased out. And we think this is a really important policy. Importantly, for the CETP that was signed at COP26, it includes a number of developing countries as well. And that's a clear sign that actually this is not just a developed country issue, but this is developing countries want money, want finance for renewable energy investments, but can't obtain it. And they know that actually ending the finance that we give to oil and gas will help make the finance available for renewable investments. And that was one of the things I had encountered as an ambassador overseas for the UK. It was easy for me to get hold of export finance to support an oil and gas project. It was much harder to get hold of export finance for renewables. So we were really keen to get developing economies to sign this too. Of course, since COP26, Russia-Ukraine has changed a lot of the debate on oil and gas around the world, and on energy in particular. But what we've seen is that actually, although it's changed the debate, when you look for the answers, they're often the same. And in the UK, after the start of the war in Russia-Ukraine, we ran an energy security strategy review to look at what we needed to do to ensure that we had access to the energy we needed to keep our lights on, to keep the economy going. And the result of that was actually to not only reconfirm, but also to accelerate and make more ambitious our targets in the renewable energy sector, lifting our offshore wind target, for example, from 40 gigawatts by 2030 to 50 gigawatts compared to the 10 gigawatts we have now. So we found that the answers on climate and the answers on energy security were very well aligned. And this remains a priority then going into the G7. And as was mentioned, it's exciting that now Japan has signed up to the commitment, essentially, by the language in the G7 Climate and Energy Ministers statement. And then we've seen it reaffirmed in the leaders' communique. Now, there is clear that actually there are countries in the G7 who are having problems to, you know, they've got to work hard to keep their energy security in the years and in the months ahead as a result of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and countries that were heavily dependent on imported gas from Russia are having to look for alternatives. So you see that very time limited, very tightly defined exclusion to the policy that a couple of countries in the G7 were arguing for. But what's important is that for my country and for several other countries in the G7, our commitment to the policy remains unchanged. There'll be no change to UK policy as a result of what was said in the G7, and we go forward to implement it and continue to internationalize it. And we work hard on a weekly basis with our partners, setting out workshops so that we can actually share the lessons from our experience to others. And I suppose the final comment I'd say is, having taken this step in the UK, and some of the agencies were nervous of taking it, actually the feedback a year on has been amazing. Actually, the question is, why didn't we do this sooner?
Great. Well, I'm sure maybe we can get to some of that in the discussion later. And it's great to hear that the UK is sticking to the commitment it's made in Glasgow last year, despite some of these caveats in the G7 statement. Joachim, I'd like to turn to you now. If you're here, thanks for joining us. So you are from the Dutch Development Bank, FMO. Joachim, I'd like to ask you, can you give us some concrete examples of the lessons and the good practices that you've learned implementing the Glasgow Statement over the last year?
Sure, thanks so much, Chloe. Very happy to be here today. I think similar to the UK, already in the run-up to COP, we worked very hard to get our policies up to scratch, so we could be ready to sign up to in the end also this statement, which we were very excited about. And I think that's probably an important lesson, that it takes time, effort, and focus, and a lot of internal and at times also external stakeholder engagement to get your policies adjusted to an ambitious kind of transition strategy, and plan for it and allocate resources to it. I think is an important lesson. So what we did is we had some ambitious exclusions that we added to our policy, essentially taking out upstream, midstream, downstream. We're not financing that directly anymore at all, and more or less all of the power generation, including fossil, is also excluded, with the exception of a very narrow exception ground for the poorest countries. And even there in practice, even though technically we're still able to do it, because we have a renewables first approach in originating our new transactions, at the moment we don't even have any of those in the pipeline. So in practice, currently nothing on the horizon. And we're left with a few other elements of exceptions that you also mentioned, Lucille, in terms of, for example, still being able to finance clean cook stoves, etc., which I think is an element that really fits to a just transition that we do want to focus on as well. Now we can go into some of the more concrete examples on what we do on the renewable side, for example, when we discuss in the panel. I do want to point to the importance of the don'ts and the do's, not only at the institutional level, but also at the country level here at home in the developing countries. What we do find in implementing this pledge is a challenge, is the narrative of we will no longer finance with our public money in your country, whilst in some of our home countries, we're not only continuing actually financing gas, for example, we're even considering labeling it green. And that really doesn't help in the storyline. So I do think that as developing countries, we need to be a role model at home for what we seek to achieve abroad as well. And similarly in the do's, it's clear that a commitment like this about what we won't be doing with our public finance also implies a commitment of what we will be doing. And I think it's very important that we deliver not only on the 100 billion that we already committed together, but actually go beyond that so that we can really generate a just transition for these countries. And I think that's also an area where FMO can certainly help. So happy to go into some more detail in the panel discussion, but I'll leave time for others as well.
Great, no, that's really some really great insights there. Really interesting to hear you reflect. I think that was the EU taxonomy there that you were reflecting as the EU labeling gas green, which doesn't help, which I'm sure we will want to come back to in the discussion. But first, I'd like to turn to Vivienne Yeder from the East African Development Bank. Vivienne, if you're great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. And so, Vivienne, I'd like to ask you, how can the successful implementation of this pledge accelerate the clean and a clean and just energy transition in East Africa? And where do you see challenges and where do you see opportunities in doing so?
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss our region, East Africa, and how we are seeing the climate debate developing. I think when we attended the COP26, having braved the COVID pandemic to actually attend it, we came away with the impression that the whole world was very serious and understood the existential threat that we are all facing collectively. And so we signed the statement and left COP26 with the full expectation that within this year, we would see very immediate, decisive, aggressive even efforts by all countries concerned to ensure that we have the targets that we have given and the commitments that we made are met. But I think from our neck of the woods, we think and we see a rather very lackluster approach to the climate pandemic, if I may call it, that we are facing, with almost anecdotal or very casual approach to the commitments that were made. And consequently, in terms of financing, as has been said, we're not getting enough funding for green energy. We have a different problem from probably the developed economies in that we are still developing our energy infrastructure. And therefore, green energy is an option. And we have the resources that we can use to develop clean energy. So we have geothermal, we have hydro, we have wind, which can be developed. But what is lacking is the financial resources to do so. And when we get the financing to do so, it's also very highly priced. And therefore, it becomes a very difficult debate in an economy that has oil and gas that is easier and readily available to exploit, and there's funding for it, to actually turn away that funding and move to green energy, which is more costly to fund, and there isn't enough resources to fund it. So there's that conundrum. There's also the discussions about the transition, a just transition, because for some of our economies, they've recently developed their oil fields or gas fields, and so they still have long concessions running, and some of those are funded by commercial debt, which will have to be paid for. And the expectation was that it would be paid for through the use of those resources. So if we are going to disincentivize and ask countries to move away from those natural resources, then we have to find a mechanism to support the repayment of that debt, and some of it is commercial. So we would have expected some sort of funding at an international level, and seeing that this is a global problem where there could be funds to help in actually mothballing some of the very high polluting coal or oil projects, which are of a long duration. We also would have expected to see that there would be a very targeted disincentivization plan for corporates and countries and financial institutions that are funding oil and gas projects. There isn't any disincentive really that we're aware of. But the thinking was that if there was a very clear disincentive to finance projects like that, either through regulatory measures or through fiscal measures or other measures, then maybe that would slow down the funding of those kinds of projects, and those resources then would be deployed to green energy. So if there was an incentive plan to finance green energy and a disincentive to finance the oil and coal and gas, then maybe that would be a trigger to move the funding from where it is now to green energy. But without that clear policy decision and on a global scale, I think that the people or communities or businesses will continue to do what they know best. Now in our region, as I said, there's a lot of opportunity. We have needs for off-grid solutions for communities that are far away from the grid. We have communities that are not yet connected to any source of stable energy. And those are the communities that we really like to support through financing of energy projects, which are sustainable and which are also viable and are green. So in East Africa, the opportunities abound. The funding is not available, and when it's available, it is at a high cost. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivienne. That was really insightful and some really interesting ideas there about disincentives for fossil fuel financing and incentives for clean energy. Maybe we can come back to that in our discussion. But before, let's hear from Promise Selawu, who's joining us from Nigeria. Hi, Promise. Are you able to? Great to see you. Thank you for joining us today. So Promise, I would like to ask you about the role that civil society can play in ensuring that this statement, this COP26 pledge is delivered and implemented, and that the money is redirected to developing countries' clean energy priorities. What do you see the role of civil society in doing this.
Thank you very much for this privilege and opportunity to have this, to be on this panel. Coming back from COP26, one of the things that happened to me was the increase in domestic gas, that's cooking gas in Nigeria. And the increase was up to 100%. And that blew my mind because Nigeria pledged to have gas as transitional fuel for till 2060. Saying that, a few of us realized that we're in bigger trouble than we thought. And the need to transit became more obvious and more paramount, even in our discussions. But looking at the role of civil society, I believe strongly that some of us have worked with young people at the grassroots level, and we've seen the beautiful things young people are capable of doing. I've met young people who have transformed petrol vehicles into electric cars here in Nigeria. I've seen young people who have been able to use the burning of waste and convert them into energy use for their local or domestic use. I've seen people transform generators, so I think that part of what we are able to do is to be involved in the conversations, particularly when it comes to engagement at the grassroots level, when it comes to showing examples and seeing the possibilities at the grassroots level. CSOs play a very important role. I mean, in things like this. I also believe very strongly that quite a number of the strategies and the frameworks that will deliver these finances to the grassroots level can come from CSOs. CSOs are able to have the grassroots context and relate very clearly with the donor requirements and bring these things to bear even at the grassroots level. I believe very strongly that gas is not the solution for a country like Nigeria. We know that the infrastructures for gas do not even exist for domestic use. And so moving completely away from that idea gives us an edge. And when we talk about transition, for us, it's an opportunity for those beautiful innovations by young people whom we've worked with and we've seen can become a great scale-up of what we'll assume as, or what we have thought as impossible in our own context. So for me, those are the things I look at. And I think that CSO play a very, very important role and can do a lot more than just being informed but being engaged in the issues.
Great, some really great remarks there as well. Thank you so much, Promise. That's great, and I'm absolutely amazed everybody stuck to the time perfectly. So thank you very much for making my job a lot easier. We can now turn to the group discussion. So we've got 25 minutes to discuss this issue with the whole panel. So please do feel free to put your video back on, and hopefully we can make this part of the conversation a bit more interactive as well. And I really encourage you, if you want to respond to something someone has said, please feel free to do so. Give me a visual nod or just jump straight in if I'm not getting the signal. It's not always that easy on video to see when people want to talk. So yeah, make sure if you want to respond to what someone has said, you do so. Yeah, so some great points raised, and I would like to go back to the geopolitical context to start off, and then move progressively towards implementation delivery, how we can build on good practices and some of the ideas, for example, that Vivienne mentioned on how to move things forward. But first, maybe back to you, John. I think it was great to hear you say that the UK stands firm on its commitment to the COP26 statement. I guess, given the current geopolitical context, how do you think this pledge can still be implemented? And do you see the war in Ukraine and the the resulting energy crisis as something that is slowing down the implementation, as impeding it? And how do we get over that?
So thanks for that. I will try and answer as best I can. So first things first, as I said, the G7 statement doesn't lead to any change in UK national policy, and I think that's true for several other G7 member states too. So that policy continues. Secondly, as I highlighted, when we look at what we need to do to ensure our energy security in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, often the answers that are generated from that question are the same answers that we would get if we asked what do we need to do to accelerate our fight against climate change. And you saw that in the UK with the increased commitments to greater renewable targets in light of our energy security review. And you see it in other countries too. You've seen it in Germany as they accelerate their plans to take on renewables in the German economy. But equally, there's a tension in Germany. They've been heavily dependent on Russian gas imports. They need to keep the lights on whilst they build out renewable infrastructure, and hence the need to look for alternative sources of gas to keep the lights on in Germany, to keep that economy going. I think some of the mainstream media has yet to catch up, but I think there is a consensus, an emerging consensus amongst policymakers and across the G7 that actually accelerating our push towards net zero is the solution to the global gas crisis and the solution to the energy crisis that's been brought on by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and not the cause of the crisis, as some of the media might suggest. So we need to push forward and accelerate that trend. I think that, the Glasgow Statement was clear in that we wanted to carve out some clear and exceptional circumstances, and some of them are for really good reason. We've got exemptions in the UK, for example, getting diesel generators into humanitarian situations to ensure that refugees have got power and access to lighting and so on. We've got exemptions for cooking gas because we know it then can reduce the amount of deforestation that goes on and actually reduce emissions from forest and land use. There is an exemption that we also sort of see for decommissioning work in the fossil fuel sector. We need to be able to decommission the assets and support companies to decommission, and our experience in the nuclear sector is that can cost a lot of money. But we need to get to a place, as Vivian described, where it's cheaper to obtain finance to build a wind farm in Kenya or Uganda than it is to build an oil field or a pipeline, and that's got to be the goal of our policy. There is a slight tension between the idea of buying out assets and essentially the biggest disincentive of all to investing in fossil fuels, which is the risk of stranded assets. And if you're sort of saying you're going to buy out assets, then you actually reduce the risk of creating stranded assets that might not accelerate you along that path. And that's a tension that we will need to manage. But no, I think the overall trend of policy is clear, even though in the very short term, for the reasons that I think everyone understands, Russia-Ukraine will place a particular pressure on a couple of G7 member states who've been heavily dependent on imported gas.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's I think that's the state of play, and these G7 statements also need to take into account not necessarily the most ambitious countries' views, but need to be a consensus, and so countries have to compromise, and clearly. We've been hearing that the UK has been doing quite a good job behind the scenes of trying to make sure this wasn't watered down too much as well. So I'll just add that. But Joachim, bringing you back in as well. I mean, it was really interesting to hear you talk about just how gas is perceived more generally, even in developing countries, and how European countries, for example, developed countries are still using gas, very much relying on it. And seeking new gas deals, and particularly in the position Germany is in. So I'm just kind of interested to hear from you a bit more about, how do you think this statement affects the implementation of the COP26 pledge, and what signal really do you need from countries? You as a development bank, what signal are you expecting from them to make sure that we're not rowing back, but we're actually moving forward? This is temporary, and this is very limited to the circumstances of the energy crisis.
Sure. Yeah, I think, like I said, the statement focuses in part on what we will not do, and there if you make a statement, then deliver on it, I would say. But importantly, I think it is also the focus on what we will be doing. And I think that really makes a difference on this one. To come into our countries and only say we will not be financing fossil is not enough. It's really also about what we will be financing and how we will help to finance a just transition. So I think that's really important. And there, I mean, the IEA came out last week highlighting the challenge that I think only about a fifth of global clean energy development is going into emerging economies, whereas they actually represent 2/3 of the population. So it's clear that we really need to increase ambition levels and volumes there. We need to focus on countries where we can still make a big difference. A nice example, I think, in the FMO portfolio is Burkina Faso. If you look at their energy system, it's about 85% is still actually heavy fuel, oil, fossil based. We actually work together with the government through a public-private partnership to invest in a number of solar plants and to help actually also generate additional green energy. Because at the moment, only 1 in 5 people there have access to energy, which also highlights this need for a just and inclusive transition, where we really help to generate additional energy for these countries. So I think that's really where the focus needs to be. How do we get more money in? Some of that is on the financing side, where parties like FMO can help. I think there's also money needed that's more at the subsidization side. As Viviane also pointed out, we need to get costs down. And of course, besides the actual mitigation story, there's also an adaptation and resilience story, where I think, again, to make this all add up for the countries where we operate, countries that are already suffering from the impacts of climate change to a degree that exceeds the impacts in our developing countries, I think we must also come on board with additional adaptation and resilience funding. And I think then the combination of actually providing additional financing, adding additional subsidization to some of the newer technology, storage is an example, as well as providing adaptation and resilience funding, I think then you have a package that makes sense, where you can actually deliver on a just transition for these countries, in combination with the fossil exclusions that we've committed to. And I think that combination is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, so very good point, and echoes directly what Viviane was saying, that some of these fossil fuel projects in developing countries are actually seen as a way to pay back commercial debt, which is obviously a sort of another issue, but shows how everything is linked. And so this has to be part of a comprehensive finance package. Viviane, I'd love to hear a bit more from you on those points. I mean, you mentioned the need for disincentives for fossil fuel financing and incentives for clean. I mean, can you give us some concrete examples of forms of support, that would fit those categories? Can you sort of elaborate on what you meant by that?
So, thank you. I think the thinking behind this is that obviously, if we leave the decision on whether to organize one's businesses or affairs to their discretion, it's not likely that we're going to get the momentum that we need. So at a political, government, and geopolitical level, we need to come up with decisions that limit the level of discretion, because obviously for most businesses or individuals, we are accustomed to the lifestyles that we have. And so to shift from that mode of operation or lifestyle requires a disincentive of some sort. So fiscal policies, it could be, depending on what's agreed at the global level, because this cannot just be at the local level, but maybe an increased tax of some sort, which is significant. Penalties also for heavy pollution or for financing of projects that are heavy pollutants. And this could be a taxation both locally in the country of operations and also in the home country where the particular entity is domiciled. I think this would then disincentivize, say, international funders or banks or developers of these kinds of projects from financing the same technology overseas which they're not able to do in their home countries because of regulation and other things. Incentives on the other side, also probably tax breaks for those particular funders who provide money for projects in developing countries or even in their own countries. It doesn't have to be just developing countries, even in developed countries, so that projects that are funding for green energy, for wind, for solar, geothermal, then there could be a tax benefit in terms of that financing. The other most important thing is to get the funding in at a price that is affordable, because at the end of the day, the end consumer is the household or the family that is using that energy. And if green sources of energy, say wind, are more expensive to produce in certain countries than, say, coal, then at the domestic level, there's no incentive to change your source of energy. You will go for the cheapest. So if the cheapest is the dirtiest, then that's what many families can afford because they're doing this on their budget. So the idea also is to make the end user or the end beneficiary of the energy incentivized because the price is low. So we would want to deliver this energy to the business, to the home, at the lowest possible price and lower than, say, oil-based or coal or gas. The other aspect that I think that this relates to stranded assets. When I was talking about stranded assets, I was talking about funding of already existing projects or any existing industries based on coal or oil or gas. And there could be a cutoff date to say those investments that were made pre-2015, for instance, could be supported so that either we begin to wind them down or begin to slow down on the operations as we bring up energy from other sources, so that it's not an incentive to new investments. It's a disincentive actually to new investments, but it supports those countries that funded these projects prior to the commitments that have now been made, because this is a very key issue. The other issue is that we're saying we're moving away from oil-based, fossil fuel-based economies, but some of the low-income countries, actually the entire economy is based on either oil, particularly. So if we're going to say that the entire global community is not going to use fossil fuel, then those communities have no other economic activity to support the economy. So we also have to think about how we diversify the economies, or how we replace oil and gas with other more productive activities, so that those economies then are able to survive and they're actually resilient. And that also goes for the human resources, people who are employed in those sectors. How do we then either reskill them or move them to other sectors where their skills can still be relevant? And if we are going to shut down those particular sectors, then they will not be stranded.
Yeah. Yeah, some really interesting thoughts, and I saw several people, other panelists, nodding at various moments. So I'm sure some things to be discussed further as well. Promise just to bring you in here. Lots of interesting things about the choice that people are making in developing countries is also down to price. Do you have concrete examples of projects you've worked on or things you've seen that can show where this finance to clean energy actually would directly support a just transition for people? And if that money was shifted from fossil fuels to clean, on the ground, there'd be a direct impact. Can you talk a little bit about an example, for example, you've seen?
Yeah, certainly. I think Nigeria, a very huge population of Nigerians don't even have access to energy in the first place. And that makes it really, really bad for us. And for 80% of people who are connected to the national grid, they have alternative power sources, which we all know are generators, running on diesels, running on petrol. And so many, we have so many records of people who have died as a result, directly or indirectly, as a result of some of these, of the use of generators generally. Beyond that is the fact that the cost of production, the cost of living, all goes up as a result of the increase in prices of these products, as the case is actually in Nigeria now. But talking about projects that we've done, and this for us is part of what has motivated Tearfund as an organization to begin to look at ways of changing this narrative within our context. So the last project we did, which was really exciting for me, was done in the northeast of Nigeria, in Adamawa State, working with young people. And what we did was we transformed some of the materials that have been condemned, electronic materials, what we call e-waste, that have been condemned. Some of them were transformed into different solar components. And these components were put together and were installed in a local facility, in a local health facility that have not had power for close to 2 years. And so, of course, that was a miracle for that community, that not just that we went ahead and bought new solar items, but that young people were able to put together components of e-waste to become solar, something useful as power in that kind of community. And so part of what happened, I mean, of course, naturally what happened was that many other communities started coming up to say, look, we also have this need in our community. How can you help us get power into community facilities such as this? So we have so many of those kind of stories of how we are using renewable energy to transform communities, and not just transform communities, but also provide some kind of economic-based activities for young people who have nothing to do. You know, I mean, Nigeria has one of the highest demography of young people who are unemployed. So we've tapped into that. So we're doing both waste management, we're doing solar installation, and providing income for low-end income earners.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that promise. That sounds like a really, exciting achievement, that project. Thank you for sharing that. I'd like to turn back to John. I mean, we've heard, the transformative ability of when the money is actually channeled to these clean projects. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of diplomatic work the UK is now doing, to ensure the signatories are actually delivering in the maybe aggressive way that Vivian would like to see, to make sure their money is flowing to these green energy projects. And just to tag on to that, Joachim was talking about the narrative, maybe the developing countries see of maybe of some form of hypocrisy from richer nations that are still using gas at home while telling others they shouldn't be doing so. Does that need to become part of the conversation? Should the UK also shift fossil fuel finance, its own domestic finance, to clean energy?
Thanks, Gosh. There's a lot in several questions there. So diplomatically, and in fact, just talking about diplomacy, and one of the things that is integral in our policy is that now our embassies can't lobby on behalf of oil and gas projects. That's not allowed anymore under our policy. So that is changing the work of some of our diplomatic missions around the world, as you can imagine if you were based in certain countries. We are working, we've got a team here in the COP26 unit in the Cross Bays that works and holds regular meetings with all the signatories of the document back at COP26, explaining our policy experience, how it's going, explaining how we went through our policy design, and working very closely with Dutch colleagues and others to help countries sort of finalise their own policies. And I think, although not many have been made public now, there are many that are ready, that are going to be picked up and made public in the days and weeks to come. So that is moving ahead. I think one of the big challenges we have is we need to win the argument about gas power, because there are some countries and some individuals who've argued that actually what we've signed up to do is going to hold countries' economic development back. And you know, I personally, and it's the position of my government, we disagree with that view. And as Vivian has pointed out, actually, that the challenge is rather that there's not enough funding available for renewable projects, and we need to put money into renewables, because renewables can be ramped up far more quickly and give energy access to a far more diverse range of people than fossil fuel power has historically been able to do. And if you look at rooftop solar as an example, the very fact that rooftop solar costs in some countries now are below the cost of transmission of electricity from a fossil fuel power station is revolutionary, because it means it's cheaper to generate power on your roof than it is to send it down a line before you've even generated it at a coal-fired power station. So you know, we need to win that argument and show that actually there are serious emerging economies like India that are making really rapid transitions towards renewable energy, really significant amounts of investment, you know, hundreds of gigawatts of electricity planned. You can drive a modern economy on renewable energy. And as we've set out, it's the UK's objective to have an overwhelmingly decarbonised grid ourselves by 2035. Now, historically, we have adopted gas in the UK as a way to move away from coal and to reduce our emissions from coal. And that's part of a historical process, and it's enabled us to reduce our emissions significantly. But the era when we started adopting gas as a power source was an era when the cost of renewables was way above what it is now. And as the cost of renewables has fallen and fallen, they're now outcompeting gas. And indeed, renewables plus battery storage are outcompeting gas in many markets. So we don't put public money into gas in the UK. We're rapidly moving off gas power as we decarbonise our energy grid, and that's written into our legally binding carbon budgets. We have to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases by 78% by 2035 in our 6th carbon budget. So we're rapidly moving away from gas, and in that context, it makes no sense to put our public money into gas overseas. Now, that's not to say that countries can't put money into gas, but it's just we don't want to be investing it in ourselves. There are 1 or 2 exemptions, and I've talked about that. You know, where have you got a country like South Africa that's also heavily dependent on very dirty coal? If you can accelerate their decarbonisation process through some limited support for downstream gas power, that might actually speed their transition away from coal and reduce the overall amount of greenhouse gas emissions, sort of the area under the graph, if you like, as they make their transition towards their own ambitious targets. But I think it's, you know, it doesn't stop private sector investing in gas, but then let the market decide. And if the private sector thinks there's a really strong risk of stranded assets, then that's a lesson in itself for us to be observant of. Thank you. Okay,
so some opportunities or some contexts in which gas can be used as a transition fuel, possibly to move away from polluting coal. Joachim, to come back to you, what do you think needs to happen? You know, between now and COP27, there's 5 months, very little time, or let's say between, you know, until the end of the year. What do you think needs to happen to show progress on how this pledge is being delivered, and also help shift the narrative, as you were talking, to show that there needs to be money flowing to the clean stuff, the clean energy?
Yes, very little time left. I agree. I think step 1 is continue the policy work. And I think the report shows that there's progress to be made on that front. And I was happy to hear John's stories around how there has been progress made, and hopefully that will also become public. So I think that is important, so that we have aligned and harmonized policies where possible across the financing parties. I think a lot of progress is being made already by the DFIs, as your report also shows, which I think is encouraging, and I hope others can build on that. So that, I think, is on how the institutions steer themselves, and from there on, it's really scaling up the positive work and the financing. We've heard about off-grid as a sector, which is one that FMO is also financed extensively. Of course, we've got solar generation, wind power. I think another interesting area to explore is transmission and distribution, where I think also a lot needs to happen to be able to actually absorb all that new generation capacity that we would like to finance and develop. So that's also, I think, an interesting area to explore collectively. How can we upgrade the transmission and distribution in the target countries together? And of course, there's a storage element, and for that, I think still we need significant subsidized or blended finance money. So I think that's another area. If we want to make good on this pledge, we also need to find ways to deliver base load to the countries that we're targeting at affordable costs. And I think particularly the storage side still requires a bit of subsidy in some cases. So I think that's something where also the governments could come on online and on stream, if you will, to develop more financing, especially on the subsidized levels for storage. Great, yeah. Some really interesting response there. Very briefly before we open it to Q&A, and I want to make sure we can get the audience to ask you questions as well. Vivienne, in just a few words, and a big question, sorry, but how do you think we can expand the signatories to this statement, and maybe particularly from the developing country side? What can be done in the next few months and ahead of COP maybe to grow the signatories?
Thank you. I think that we should be aiming to grow the signatories from the developing country side, particularly those countries that are largely known to be either funders or large polluting countries. And one way of doing this would be through the membership of multilateral development banks, to make it a priority, first of all, and then make it mandatory for the MDBs, the larger MDBs that are not signatories or that have not had very clear statements as to their funding. Also regional economic communities, if there could be agreements and commitments at that level, which can be then leveraged to expand to other membership. The UN bodies, the very good sounding boards, but we now need to move them into action and to see whether these can also become resolutions at a global level. Because if we all agree that this problem is global and that the solution must be global, it's not just local, then I think we must engage all our existing resources at the international level and the global community level to come up with a very clear commitment, and then have sanctions that are tied to breaches of those commitments. Because without a clear framework for monitoring and for also sanctioning breach, then this whole commitment just remains discretionary and piecemeal, and will not be able to get the momentum that we need.
Yeah, very clear. I think very clear message. We need to make sure that this doesn't remain piecemeal. Let's move on now to the Q&A, because we've got some really good questions that have come through, and want to make sure to have time to ask them. So please, panelists, stay on. I'll direct the questions to you, to all of you. But the first question is, what do the panelists propose as ways to shift the narrative and the finance away from fossil gas, including LNG? And how can we bring an end to its use as a so-called transition fuel? So I think, John, you were saying that in some cases, going from coal to gas can be a good thing. The question here is actually, how do we go beyond that? How do we move the narrative beyond LNG, beyond gas as a transition fuel? Anybody wants to go first? John, do you want to respond? Or?
Let me try. I mean, look, I know not everyone agrees with me, but the analogy I use is these devices. I've worked in Africa for 30 years, and when I did my PhD in Kenya, you had to wait 8 years for a landline to be built to your house. And if you'd have said that within 25 years there would be more phones than people in Kenya, everyone would have laughed at you. But now, we don't build landlines in Africa, and indeed in Europe now. Many of my friends have given up their landline. You just have a mobile phone, and it gives you everything you need. You don't need to have the old technology, and it's enabled telecommunications to reach deep into sort of some of the most rural areas of the world and the poorest areas of the world. One of the things that nearly everybody has is a mobile phone. And in the same way, now that rooftop solar generation is cheaper than the cost of transmitting power along a grid that's already there, it's never going to be cheaper to build out a grid to many rural areas in remote parts of some of the least developed countries, it's always going to be cheaper to have green mini grids that sort of built locally. You don't have to build out a national transmission network. You have a simple green mini grid, and one of the projects that is likely to be funded under the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa is the repurposing of a power station, and they'll be using some of the machine tools there to build containerized mini grids that can be just trucked out and put in a place to develop power locally. So yeah. I think we need to really accept that transition can take place. There is a relevant point that someone flagged, which is, scale. And one of the problems we're going to have to overcome with development finance institutions is it's much cheaper to do your due diligence and to lend hundreds of millions of dollars to an oil and gas project than it is to lend $1 million to hundreds of renewable projects. And we need to find some way around that problem. And that's one of the sort of the challenges that we face in making sure that we take full advantage of the renewable revolution to get power to the poorest people who need it most.
Yeah, okay, really. So, cost must be part of the narrative in a way, like this technology is becoming cheaper, in many cases. Thomas, you were nodding a lot. Do you want to add anything to that? How do you think we can shift this narrative of gas as a transition fuel?
I think indeed, it's very obvious that it costs countries like Nigeria a lot more to set up a gas system.
Maybe we've lost Promise.
I mean, the land. Yeah, so I was just saying that it's actually a lot easier to consider renewable energy.
You're breaking up, Promise, a little bit. I'm really sorry, and I just see Joachim has his hand up. So
it's a lot easier to look at something that is evolving.
Sorry, you're just breaking up a little bit, Promise. I was just going to turn to Joachim, and maybe if you want to hold that thought and come back, unless you look stable now, if you want to just finish your sentence, because you were breaking up.
Yes, so I think for me, right, it's important to accept the fact that this change has come to stay, and to begin to look at the strategies and the frameworks that actually gets the money to the grassroots. I mean, gets the funds to the grassroots. I think for me, that gives us, for a country like Nigeria, it gives us the hope that we need to want to take that step. Nigeria did not sign up to this statement. And it's not surprising because quite a number of people will think that these statements are just statements. But when we begin to put the strategies and the frameworks that gets it down to the grassroots in place, then it becomes a motivating factor for countries like Nigeria to step in and say, we're ready, we really want to get this done.
Okay, yeah, very clear. Money needs to flow to the grassroots. Joachim, in a few words, if you can, because we've got interesting questions that have come through. Your contribution to this, how do we shift the narrative?
Yeah, I think a few elements. So the first one, as John pointed out already, I think, is shift to impact maximization, which I think is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to maximize the impact of public finance. So that's step one. I think step two is in our markets where we're trying to target this money. It's, with a few exceptions like South Africa, not so much a transition strategy, but just a growth strategy, right? So gas isn't actually transitioning, it's actually building up additional growth potential. And there the question is whether these countries should want to lock into a gas-based infrastructure for the long term. And two arguments against that, other than climate, which is an obvious one, where the impacts actually are largest in the markets where we finance anyway, are that there may also be some impacts in terms of their exports. If you get a carbon border tax in the EU, it may actually be quite an expensive way to build your industry in the long run. And the other one is actually your balance of payments. So a lot of the countries where we operate spend a very significant part of their balance of payments on fossil fuel imports, and that's an energy security issue. So I think also for some other reasons than climate, which by itself is a pretty strong argument, I'd say, it can be a good strategy for these countries to build their economies on a renewable energy basis, and essentially leapfrog, which is John's point with the phones.
Yeah. Made the argument clear with the mobile phone. Okay, another really good question's come through, and I would like to ask this to Vivienne. The question is that finance is available for the production of solar energy from, for example, the World Bank. But is there any bank which provides finance or grants for setting up small windmills or small wind farms, I guess, for individuals? So kind of off-grid wind.
I don't know where the question, where the person asking the question is based, but if I answer the question from East Africa, yes. There is financing through regional development banks like ours, the East African Development Bank, and also the national development banks, because it's part of the regional strategy to support use of solar and wind, and particularly at the household level or at the community level through mini grids, because it is obvious that this is the only way that we can provide energy support to largest economies to larger communities in the quickest and the shortest time possible. So the answer is yes.
So does the East African Development Bank provide finance, for example? Do you do it?
Yes, we do. We would do it for industries and for larger consumers, but we also work in partnership with smaller development banks and commercial banks to provide funding, concessional funding for green energy.
Okay, great. So a positive response there. So I'm sure Agaval, if you want to follow up, there seems to be scope to do so on that. Another question has come through from Ivan, who's from Awin Group Japan, an Indonesian renewable energy society. For developing countries with fiscal limitation to give incentive for renewables and need to make it affordable, where do you think the source of money for the subsidy and incentive should be coming from? So developing countries which are cash-strapped, with tight fiscal budgets, or kind of a fiscal crisis. How do we incentivize renewable energy? Where does that money need to come from? I don't know if Vivienne or Joachim, you want to take that? Joachim, yeah.
Sure. So I think we've seen this happen in various ways. One example has been Uganda, where I think the EU was able to finance and subsidize essentially their renewables program, and that then allowed them to set up a whole public-private partnership program that generated quite a lot of renewable projects in the country. A very different mechanism that also functions is through blended finance, where essentially you provide the subsidy through blending, through FMO, or the IFC World Bank also does it, enabling us to actually offer lower interest rates on the same type of project. So there's various ways, I think, to deliver such subsidies, and depending on the context and the country, pick one and get it done, I would say.
Okay, and I know that John needs to dash off a little bit early to catch a train. He might be off already. If you are off, John, if you can still hear me, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, John had to leave. But we've got sort of 5 more minutes for questions. So there's another question here. What do you think is holding investment in more demand-focused renewables, such as rooftop solars, batteries, mini grids, etc., in developing countries? So what is holding up those investments? Do you think it would be a good option to support that type of renewable energy generation instead, or larger renewable energy-based power plants? So I guess, what's the advantage of going for these mini grids options? I don't know if Promise, you or Vivienne, you would like to answer that.
Yeah, so for us in Nigeria, I think one of the things we've realized is that the solar systems are expensive, They're pretty expensive for individuals to afford. But over the past few years, they've become cheaper, which is good news, right? It's good news. But again, we've also realized that locally fabricated solar components like the inverters, the charge controllers are a lot more cheaper and still almost as durable as the brand new ones. So a lot of people are now also going for that, for that system. So I think largely what's responsible is the cost. The cost of mini grids are they're a bit high, but it's easier to have standalone systems. So we've also done quite a lot of standalone systems for individual homes. It's a lot more affordable for such people.
Right. So there's it can be cheaper and it's quicker to the upfront cost, I guess, is less than a huge, solar farm, and it's quicker to roll out as well and get that energy to people. I think we've got time for one last question. The question is, and maybe this is a good one to end on. Can you say which countries are definitely going to stick to the COP26 statement following? I suspect this is following the G7 communique and the recent kind of shift back to gas that we've seen following the invasion of Ukraine. I'm not sure anybody will be able to answer with certainty, but maybe Vivienne, what are your hopes, and maybe what is your message to the signatories of the statement? Why is this so? Why should they stick to the commitment? What is your message to them?
Okay, I would certainly, it's a difficult question, but I would expect that the UK, being the convener of the pledge at COP26, will certainly stick to it, and probably Netherlands and Denmark, because we've seen, probably Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, because we've seen a concerted effort on their part to live up to their pledges, even without being signatories. But I think the message I would give is that we have a very good precedent in the COVID pandemic, where the global community realized that we are all linked. We may live in diverse regions, but there are certain situations where we are linked, and this is one of them. This is a global pandemic. And so local solutions are very good, but global solutions are essential. And so a piecemeal approach to this problem will not get us to where we need to go, and time is not on our side. So I'd say we approach it with the same zeal that we did and commitment to address the COVID pandemic and do what we need to do. We have to make changes to our economies, our own lifestyles, our own investments, and change the way we approach sustainability and the environment. Because a loss of biodiversity and the loss of the planet is not irreversible. Thank you.
I think those are absolutely great comments to end today's event on, countries that have made these commitments are expected to stick to them. Joachim, you've just popped back on. If you want to add a quick 5 words to that, you're welcome to. But I think Vivienne put it pretty well.
I think Vivienne put it very well. So I want
very well.
that.
Great.
I just wanted to say goodbye.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you so much to our panelists. John Merton's already had to dash off, but thank you so much to Joachim Straffen, Vivienne Yeder, and Promise Salawu for joining us. I think this was a really interesting conversation. Lots more questions to be asked and follow-up done in the next 5 months up to COP. So thank you so much again, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.